Welcome to this special DENconnect celebration for International Day of People with Disability. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I'm speaking to you from today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I acknowledge the ongoing connection that Aboriginal people have to this land and recognise Aboriginal people as the original custodians of this land. I would also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal people present here today. As that introduction sequence demonstrates, not all disabilities are visible. You can't know another person simply by looking at them from the outside. You may be or know someone living and working with a disability, but like all of us, their stories are unique. Today's event will be absorbing for two very different personal experiences. However, the central message remains the same: how important the inclusion of each diverse individual person is to all of us. My name is Chris Lamb. I'm Deputy Commissioner at the New South Wales Public Service Commission. This event is supported by the New South Wales Public Service Commission and the Age of Inclusion campaign, a movement dedicated to supporting and advocating for people living with disability to build a culture of respect and equality. Our theme today is There's More to Inclusion, There's More to Us. It's about celebrating diversity, what it means to be you, to be me, to be us. The campaign highlights the non-visible disabilities, like mental health, something that more and more people are recognising in our families, communities, and sometimes even within ourselves. We have two interviews today. Our first is Caroline Casey. Caroline is an inclusivity activist and all-round rock star of the diversity community. She's dedicated her life to looking past limits that we've set for ourselves and others. She's a TED speaker, social entrepreneur, adventurer, having trekked 1,000 kilometres across India on the back of an elephant, and is the founder of the Valuable 500, a global movement putting disability on the business leadership agenda. Caroline is legally blind, and as she has said herself, if disability is the elephant in the room, she'd be the one riding it. Caroline's being interviewed by the Department of Communities and Justice Secretary Michael Coutts-Trotter on how organisations can be more inclusive and unlock greater productivity and innovation. After the interview, Caroline will be online to chat with one of our DENconnect members, Jacqueline Duncan. Our audience will have the opportunity to ask Caroline a question, so please use the chat function for us to put those questions to her.
Morning here in Sydney, and it's already the start of a pretty hot day. Where are you, and what's the weather like?
Well, I'm in Dublin, Ireland. I started my day 12 hours ago in the Irish Sea, and we had to scrape the ice off the windows before we got into the car. So yeah, hey, it's a different perspective from my end.
Thank you so much for your time then at the end of a really, really busy day. Tell us why you are so passionate about getting business leaders interested in disability inclusion.
Well, I guess there's two reasons. One, it's personal. And second, it's just practical. The personal one is I have a lived experience of disability myself. I have a condition called ocular albinism, which means I'm registered blind, which I have been since my birth. I'm 49 years old now, but my parents chose not to disclose it to me. So I grew up for the first 17 years of my life not knowing that I couldn't see very well. And my father gave me a driving lesson for my 17th birthday, totally crazy. And that's when I found out I couldn't see very well. And then from that moment I hid it, and I hid it because certainly then I didn't think the world was welcoming of disability. And my parents had always brought me up to believe that none of us are defined by anything, you know. And then on the practical side of it, when I eventually came out of the closet, I was working for Accenture as a management consultant, and I'd lied to them and got away with it. I came out of the closet and I understood the scale of the disability inequality crisis, which is, it's huge. And I think because I come from an entrepreneurial background with my father, because I was working with business, I just couldn't understand why, business wasn't meaningfully at the table for disability inclusion. I mean, look, disability touches every single one of our lives at some point. And the wealth of insight and talent and innovation that existed, I didn't understand why disability did not exist in business, and it didn't. And that was 20 years ago. And that has been my absolute passion, is that the inequality crisis cannot be resolved with charities and governments alone. It needs the most powerful force on this planet, because inclusive business creates inclusive societies, but not for a worthy reason, for an incredibly powerful market opportunity, which to me is, how can you ignore 8 trillion market spending power and 72% of your global population? You would be insane, right? So it's kind of merging the personal with the practical opportunity that exists.
Look, in quite a strange coincidence, our minister here in New South Wales, who has responsibility for disability services, Gareth Ward, my minister, is a person with albinism, and himself is, in his own terms, legally blind. And he's the first person with a lived experience of disability to have that responsibility as a minister. And it really, really, really makes a difference to have someone who has lived the experience. Do you find it tiring to constantly talk about yourself and that dimension of your identity, or not?
Wow, I kind of didn't expect that. Well, thank you for asking, for starters. Yeah, I do. I do find it tiring. Look, I'm the girl, the elephant girl. I did a very well-received TED Talk. I'm very lucky. But I'm not defined by that, I'm not defined by the fact that I happen to have a visual impairment. I think a lot of times people ask me, is your resilience and you're great because you're visually impaired and, a boy named Sue and all of this stuff. And I'm just like, no, actually, because maybe it's just me, but I think we have defining moments in our life, but we're not defined by them. And you have to be very careful not to be defined by them, right? A lot of more of who I am comes from my family and where I came from, and the grit and resilience and the empathy actually of my family. I don't come from a Pollyanna family. I don't come from a Walton's family. But I also think it's very important for people to see somebody who has a direct lived experience speaking to this. People often say to me, well, you don't look legally blind, you don't look visually impaired. And I'm like, what's that supposed to look like? And the first question they ask me is like, well, why are you wearing 4-inch heels? I'm like, because I love them. I'm also a woman and I love heels and I love fashion. And so I think it's just, it's tiring, yes, but it's also very important. But I just want to be really careful. I do believe nothing without us. The lived experience is very important as part of a creation of a society which is inclusive of people with disabilities. But I also have a husband and a family and friends who love me, and they may not have a lived experience of disability, but can I just tell you, they're the champions. It's not me. There's nothing inspiring about me. I wouldn't want to be living with me or married to me. I'm an activist. I'm a troublemaker. So, I think it's really important that I speak to the truth of it, but I really welcome other people who are in my life who live around me.
People who chase you down on social media, as I did, will find some very, very funny and quite telling observations that you make about a la carte diversion or diverse-ish. And it does raise a really good question, I think, about whether you encourage disability inclusion or quite simply you demand it. What do you think the balance is there? How do you approach it?
Well, look, I don't think you can have inclusion if you're willing to leave 15% of our global population on the margins, which is the disability. There's 1.3 billion people in the world who have a lived experience of disability, and with a mother and a father, that's 73% of our global population. So how on earth can you say that you are passionate about inclusion if you're willing to leave that out? 90% of our businesses claim that. 90% of business claim I'm passionate about inclusion, but only 4% with evidence include disability. And I think that's a delusion. I don't know about you, but I don't think there's a hierarchy of inclusion or exclusion. I don't think anybody has a right to say I'm more excluded, I'm less included. I think when we speak to inclusion, we have to admit that we don't know everything, and we have to allow for all different challenges of the human experience, all different experiences to be at the table. And as I say that, I just hate the fact that I've said it, because the way we say inclusion is, diversity has been asked to the dance or the dance floor, and inclusion has been asked to dance. Seriously, can we just not remember that inclusion is about being human, and we have multiple labels? And I'm very perturbed about the past when we have corporates saying, this year we're going to focus on gender, and next year we're going to focus on LGBTQ. And you're going, seriously? Do you know how insane that sounds? Well, what about the woman who is gay, who has a disability, and who's black skin?
Yeah, of course.
Really?
We'll do a quarter of you this year, a quarter next year, a quarter the year after, and the fourth year we'll get all of you. Yeah.
It's hard, right? Isn't it just so hard being human anyway? And then when you see parts of your personality saying, oh, we're going to do that this year and then that later, you're like, no, that's crazy. And not that I want to shame any organization or any business, because that's not what this is about. And I have to be honest, with the Valuable 500, one of our core principles is we have to end the cancel culture or the shaming culture, or, look, none of us know this completely. We have to give ourselves the permission not to know. But I hope the intention behind most of us is to truly be respectful and welcoming and inclusive. But if we shame people, that the fear of them not getting it right is actually the biggest obstacle in moving forward and in progress, right? I want people to ask the questions. Often people think with my site, it's one thing, but, I have, a mom who's a recovering alcoholic, 33 years. And, I would have to say my greatest understanding about inclusion and acceptance came from her. And, I think mental health is a huge issue in our family, but everybody wants to focus on, the visually impaired elephant girl. It's just like there's so much more going on here,
What are the attributes of an inclusive leader? And you must have met many. Was there anybody who particularly stands out as a brilliant leader, inclusive leader?
Yeah, I think I learned this from my mom. Look, accountability is a big thing for us in the Caseys. I don't expect everybody to know everything or anything, actually. I just expect people to do something. And if they don't know, to ask. And if they can't do it, to say. for me, accountability is just being responsible. And I think if we don't have that, like I get things wrong all the time, and I don't mean to, I truly don't, but I do. And I think the first thing I'll do is say, look, I didn't get it. I'm sorry, I'm wrong, you know? And so for me, one of my most favorite leaders was Peter Grauer, who's the chair of Bloomberg. And when we launched the Valuable 500 on the main stage of Davos, I mean, you couldn't be more exposed, right? He just turned around and he just went, you know, I'm really proud of what we've done in this area of work or this area of work, but I'm not proud about what we've done about disability inclusion. Actually, I'm not even sure I know what to do. I was just like, oh, thank you. Like, thank you for being so human and for admitting that you don't know it all. So for me, if you ask about the attributes, is to be human, Michael, you know, to tell your story. You know, we know that 7% of our C-suite have a lived experience of disability, but 4 out of 5 of them are hiding it, as I said, and we'll be human. You know, celebrate when you get it right, be accountable when you get it wrong, be open and be curious. Like, I think that's the big thing, isn't it? Like, I don't want, if leaders are standing up there saying, oh my gosh, I have to be perfect. Well, the permutations into the culture make it really hard for people to be different, right? So we really want to get this stuff right around inclusion. You have got to give people permission to fail, to question, to seek to understand, to be vulnerable, to be different. I do think actually the situation with COVID is sort of like that breakdown, which I'm hoping is going to be a breakthrough. I really hope for that.
Excuse me. I was going to ask about that because what we've discovered in our organisation is COVID and the lockdowns meant that all of a sudden we had to become an inclusive organisation. We had to be prepared to allow people to redefine how they did their work and where they did their work. And particularly for many colleagues with disability, they said, look, this is the first time the organisation has actually been genuinely inclusive. There's some things I've been asking for a very long time that I just could not get. And all of a sudden you're throwing accessible tech at me. Nothing's a problem. And you're investing trust in me as a colleague. Do you think we're going to come out of COVID with a different take on inclusion and particularly disability inclusion as a result of those experiences?
Well, I choose to believe that. You know, I've been in this space for 20 years and there's something happening. I don't know, you can feel a change, you know. The pandemic has blown open what a lot of us knew already, you know, the inequality crisis, the imbalance, the inequity, it's terrifying, right? It really is. And I think how many of us have been hiding parts of ourselves and striving to fit in and to be accepted when all of us just want to belong, right? Just to belong uniquely as ourselves. And I think what's happened globally is everybody's wings have been clipped. And so the only thing that we share is there might have been some sense of collective empathy, what it feels like, to not be able to be self-determining for a moment. And I think that's really real, isn't it, when that's taken away? And I think my biggest hope is that we can't unknow what we know now. I also believe that business has flexed and it's changed. You just refer to it yourself. This is like, we were told the systems couldn't change, that they didn't have agility and they couldn't flex and accommodations for people with disabilities were too much and we couldn't do remote working. And I'm like, yeah they could. You've just proved it now because the will and attention was there. So maybe the uncomfortable question is right now, will the will and intention be there? Because I truly believe all this work around inclusion, whether it's disability inclusion or otherwise, it's not rocket science, right? It's really not rocket science. It's about having the will and intention. This isn't even about money. Truly, it's not about money. And I actually think we're just about to enter into a decade of total disruption where the inclusion and diversity rulebook is just being chucked out the window. It is just, forget it. Because we are gonna end this very singular siloed inclusion. We're going to end the excuses that say 1 year it's this and the other it's that, because I actually think it's the next generation who let's be honest, business care about for talent and for consumer, they're just like, no, don't tolerate it. And right at their hands, they have these tools that we didn't have, certainly I didn't have, that are saying that it's sort of like a revolution, isn't it? And so how do we work with this as business to make this work for business and work for society? Because actually it's an extraordinary opportunity. It's an extraordinary opportunity. And those companies who have survived and thrived through this pandemic are companies that really had DNA, and at their DNA was inclusion at the broadest sense, disability as well as every other.
I think your observation about the pandemic, all of us have felt vulnerabilities of one kind or another, and I think all of us have realised that the community's health is only as good as the health of the most marginalised and the most vulnerable, and I think that's really just been a remarkable realisation again in Australia about that. I think mental health is something that people have been talking about a whole lot more in the last 6 to 9 months, and that's a good thing. It's still extraordinarily stigmatized, and to the extent that mental health can really affect people's functioning over a long period of time and it becomes a disability, I think it is a disability that we find the hardest to talk about, the hardest to be curious about, the most nervous about blundering on. What's your experience of senior business figures thinking about including mental health and mental health recovery in their businesses?
Well, the most powerful thing is when a CEO or a leader speaks to their experience. Because let's be honest, all of us have mental health,
Yeah.
Like, I think this is such a weird thing, right? We all have mental health, and I don't know anybody who hasn't at some point really struggled. We have the figures 1 in 4, experience mental health at some point in their lifetimes, or experience a very challenging mental health. But I think what's important is, how many of us have gone through life and struggled? When my father passed away very unexpectedly in 2016, which was really the impetus behind me creating the Valuable 500, my world fell apart. I have to say there's been a funny part of me that has, been sort of proud of the fact that I've always been the trucker in the Casey family, like I will do this, because everybody else had a tough time around mental health. And I was like, yes, but I shall truck on. And I didn't realize that caricature I carried with me. And in Dad's passing, I really got to understand, in some ways how I had judged, because I really turned up in the very vulnerable, broken part of myself and campaigning publicly. Can you imagine how hard that was? But in doing that, I realized the power of not only owning my own story and owning what I was going through, but actually giving permission to other CEOs to do, and other leaders. And that was incredible. So I think one of the hardest things to do is own your story. And if we want to run mental health, the stats are there. The statistics and the data prove that we all experience it at some point. But the powerful capacity to change is when a human being comes to the table as a leader and says, look, this is me, and this is how I am, and this is my experience, because it gives people permission just to be themselves as well. Do I think that mental health is the most stigmatized? I think certain experiences of mental health are. And in other ones, it's quite mainstreamed, and I want to be really careful because, everybody has a very different experience and we can't package it the same way. In some ways, in some parts of the world, they say certain levels of mental health is sort of mainstreamed, and in other words, like not at all. And so I keep saying we need to make space for individual story. We cannot process this, and we need to keep having these conversations and then translating those conversations into action. And the only way we can do that is actually to talk about stuff, because when we don't talk about it, we can't do anything about it. And so for me, the Valuable 500 CEOs, of which we've had a few who have spoken to this, are possibly the most powerful. And the result of what's happened in their organizations is incredible.
And I've had a look at the list of the Valuable 500, and it's gobsmacking. There's so many global firms. many of which have workforces of dazzling diversity, ethnicity, gender, place, experience. How does the CEO of a global firm encompassing so much kind of cultural difference approach an issue as often as culturally specific as notions of disability? How do they go about that? It's an extraordinary thing to kind of face up to.
Well, how would you do it? You know,
I'm asking because I guess I would blunder and talk and just make mistakes and move through it. I hope, but
there you go. There's your answer.
Yeah, there's your answer.
You know, and I think this is the thing, isn't it? You're a human being. You know, you're no different to anybody else, and this is what we try to say. And I'm obsessed with this thing about not being defined by. I really am. I think we have to be allowed grow from our stories, from our pasts, from moments and situations. And our biggest advice to any brand and leader is, listen, you're beginning. If you are on the beginning of your journey of disability, business, inclusion, you're beginning. You know, you've got to learn, you're going to blunder, you're going to make mistakes. I do all the time. Okay. I do all the time. And so what we hope for is for leaders to give permission for their businesses to experiment and to innovate and to create. And that's the thing. The business can't do that unless the leader is willing to say, you know, I don't know if I have all of this right. And I think one of the greatest barriers for us right now, you know how many times I get on the call with a leader who just goes, listen, Caroline, I just need to apologize. We're not doing as much as we should. And I'm like, please don't say that. Please don't say that, because you're doing something right. So let's build on that. Let's find a way for you to scale that. Let's find a way for you to grow that. Let's find a way for you to change that. And I think that's what's the great value of the Valuable 500. You have this community. Like, I mean, what, we're 362 as of today. Woohoo! I'm very excited. I mean, that's like 13 million employees and, you know, 4.5 trillion in revenue, and it's global. Okay. It's global. And so can you imagine all of those leaders and all of those conversations happening in a community level? That's when they'll share. When they drop the barriers, they'll share, right? They'll share best practice. They can scale best practice. And then, you know, we can do this extraordinary thing that we're going to do. We're going to launch this transformational program next year. I mean, we began as a campaign, Michael. We had no idea. Well, I kind of did, but I didn't want to admit it. You know, we didn't have an idea that we could do this. And now, look, we're creating. Can you imagine the multiplier effect of getting 500 brands and their CEOs together in safety, resetting this business system? That's where it happens, right? Like, you can't do this stuff on its own. This is the scale of the crisis facing disability, facing inclusion in our world is way too big. Competition is great on the sports field, but not really in business when we have these problems to co-solve together. You know, differentiation, sure, for sure. But look, we need to share with each other so we can actually do this. So this becomes an opportunity, not a problem.
Is there a example that comes to mind of a business that's really developed a particular consumer market among people with disability of one kind or another? For example, here in Australia, we've got the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which is probably the most important social and economic policy development in our country in 30 years. And before COVID, you just started to see these entrepreneurial businesses spring up for disability tourism, people with mobility disability who just found the experience of tourism in different parts of Australia just deeply crap, suddenly had a business that was marketing to them. Have you got an example like that from around the world that just sort of knocked your socks off?
Okay, well, first of all, I have to give a shout out to Australia, because, you know, you guys led on the Inclusive Development Aid Program. You know, like, we look to Australia a lot. Yeah, we really do. I think that must be because there's a lot of Irish and you Australians.
It's true. Anyway. It's true.
You do things differently. And actually, we have a lot to learn from Australia. And that's why I keep trying to get as many Australian companies into this, the Valuable 500 community. But there's a few that I'm going to give you an example of. But listen, let's go iconic for a second. You know, Apple, which is the first company in the world that triggered $1 trillion, right? Like, you can't deny that that's pretty successful. Well, right at the core of their DNA is universal design. right? And so Steve Jobs, whether you liked him or you loved him, you can't deny he had a huge impact. And what he really wanted to do is create beautiful products that everyone can use. Like, just listen to that. I mean, it's incredibly smart, right? But actually, Apple is the preferred choice, not only of many of the market space who look for these devices, but also of families of people with disabilities and people with disabilities themselves. So this is a great kind of marketing that's not niche to people with disabilities, but it's using the kind of the needs of the margins to sort of blow up the extraordinary customer opportunity that exists for Apple. So that's a great example. On a much smaller scale, if you just look to M&S in the UK, I mean, they're very aware of the 249 billion spending power of the UK population, and they don't want to watch the money walk away. And so they have launched a thing called the Sunflower Lanyard. I mean, this is so simple, right? For people like me who look like we don't have a disability or have an invisible disability, you can go into their shop, you can put on the Sunflower Lanyard because you have an invisible disability, and they will come up and ask you how you need help shopping. So you see, it's once again, it is not rocket science, right? It's just about thinking about, and I often say that the barrier, if we remove barriers for people with disabilities and their families, and just let me remind you of that figure again, that's 73% of our global population. You're removing barriers for everyone. Finally, I think we're learning that accessibility and inclusion of people with disabilities is not niche. It's an opportunity for mainstream. And you actually, look, we've said this a million times, it's so cliched, I'm really sorry, but you know, if you make the physical environment for people who use wheelchairs, will you make it for people, you know, rolling along in a suitcase, or mums with buggies, or older people on crutches, or if you've had a skiing accident? Come on, we know this. Actually, I don't even think we need to make the case for this anymore. I think this is really about, you know, future-proofing our business and our society for everyone. It's not just for people with disabilities, for everyone. And those organizations and leaders who do this now, they're the early adopters and they're going to benefit the most. So I'm like, well, game on. I mean, who wants to be the fifth Beatle? I always think about this. I mean, I would hate to be the fifth Beatle. It's like, just get it on and just get moving, because you're going to be left behind. This is not if, this is a when, all right? And that when is very quick. It has become far quicker now because of COVID.
I'd settle to be the Beatles roadie, Caroline. So,
well, me too. Well, I'm a Led Zeppelin fan, I have to say. I like the Beatles, but way more Led Zeppelin and Depeche Mode. Actually, come to think of it.
Oh, okay, me too.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah. I very rarely meet a Depeche Mode fan. I just love Depeche Mode.
No, well, it's a secret that dare not speak its name. You know. Now you spent 1,000 kilometres travelling with elephants now, or an elephant. What did you discover about elephants from that experience?
Well, first of all, I discovered they are really tricky and they're really smart. My elephant was called Kanchi, and my elephant actually died unexpectedly a few weeks ago, and very young. No, not at all. She was 39 years old. I mean, she shouldn't have died. She was my greatest teacher. Sometimes, like, we all got to deal with our shit, right? You got to go deal with your stuff. Do your work, will you? You know what I mean? And I could have danced around all the reasons, blah, 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 why I wasn't dealing with my sight. And this elephant, she just kind of taught me, is like, this is going to be so cliche and you're probably rolling your eyes to heaven, but it's like, you know what? I'll love you if you love yourself. I thought if I went out to try and change the world, to accept all people, that then I would be worth something. And that elephant caught me out, they can sniff it a mile away. They were the best. She was the best therapist I ever had. And if only she could speak, but she was really tricky, but it was the most, talk about falling in love in a second. I loved her very much. And it's because she mirrored me and mirrored the work I had to do on myself, actually. Yeah. I think this is the whole thing about this whole story of inclusion. We just need to be free from our demons, free to be ourselves, free not to fit in, but free to belong. And look, this isn't a disability conversation. This is just a human right. And I think it's possible. You know, I really do. And I think business is a hugely important part of that.
I'm going to leave it there because that's a high note. Thank you so much for your time. And you might look to Australia, but there are a lot of people in Australia looking to you, your organisation, and the extraordinary things you're doing. And just sincere, big fat thank you for your time. It's been the end of a very busy day for you, I know, but the people who are going to watch this are just, I know, grateful for your time and grateful for your leadership.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I have to say, for those Australian companies who are not part of our tribe and our family, you've got about 7 weeks. We've only got 140 seats left, so come on, get it on.
Okay, Carol and Casey, thank you so much. Lovely to meet you, and hope to meet you here in Australia one day.
You too.
Wow, what a great interview. Hi everyone, my name is Jacqueline Duncan and I am a founding member of the DENconnect community and the Disability Employee Network Chair for the New South Wales Department of Communities and Justice. I have a disability that you can't see. I have psoriatic arthritis, and as a result of inflammation in my eye, I'm legally blind in one eye. I also have just been diagnosed with essential tremor. I've worked all my life and struggled with ill health, and at the most vulnerable point, I experienced significant challenges and barriers. I could not allow anyone else to experience what I did, so I joined the Disability Employee Network, or the DEN. I'm passionate about employee resource groups as it gives people like me the opportunity to have a voice, to promote disability inclusion, and to support an inclusive culture change. Welcome to Caroline. Caroline, thank you for joining us online this morning, as I know it's rather late for you in Dublin. While our audience sends through their questions via the Q&A window, I'd like to ask you one of my own. I really enjoyed your reflection on some of the simple things companies can do to be more inclusive to people with disability. In particular, the department store that offered a sunflower lanyards for people with disability to obtain extra help by shop assistants. Could you please tell us of other simple initiatives that companies have made to be more inclusive of people with disability?
Well, good night and good morning. I'm sorry, I'm very tired here today. It's just the day before International Day, and so there's been lots of talking. And Jacqueline, it's lovely to meet you. We're both legally blind. We have that in common. The most simple thing I can say any company has done, and the valuable 500 companies have done, is actually hearing what their employees who have a lived experience of disability want from them or their customers. The greatest and simplest thing any company can do is ask people or bring talent in. So for example, you're a perfect example of somebody a company would bring in and say, can you just speak to your experience, what you've learned, so that you're telling your story. And that is something that you cannot underestimate, the power of your voice and your story. Yes, the sunflower lanyard is a really simple one. The other thing we notice a lot of our companies have done, and you can check out the examples on our website, is they've brought in consultants to kind of help their organization to understand, where are you now? What's the journey going to be like? And there's the Australian Disability Network. You know, Suzanne Coburn, she is an absolute legend. She's an absolute legend. And, you know, the people are there to help. And then I think often there's some very simple things, is really the most kind of impactful part is understanding about how we communicate online now. And like maybe now because of COVID, it's just become more obvious, but are your websites accessible? Is your online digital presence, is that accessible for people like you and me who are visually impaired, for people who have hearing impairment? You know, there are so many simple things, and you add those simple things up, and that's when you get the change.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Question from Ben. I'm sorry to hear about the passing of your elephant, Kanchi. You spoke about her being a good therapist for you. How important is it for us to speak openly about our experiences with disability to our colleagues, friends, or family?
Well, I guess that's something you and I both know together. I don't know how you found it. I definitely can say for me, when I was hiding myself away and not speaking about it, a lot of energy went into hiding. And that energy now is into creating, right? Look what happened when I came out of the closet at 28 years old about my site. Well, wow, did my world blow open. Don't you think it's really strange, Jacqueline, that I actually admitted I couldn't see and I got to see more? Like, what was I doing? And in a way, every time you speak your story, I think people are probably comfortable telling their story. And I understand that we're all scared. I mean, this is not a disability thing, right? We all carry secrets, but those secrets can really can corrode our confidence. And so I think the most important thing is to be real and true. It's not easy. And that's why I'm accountable as Caroline to do my part in that. And I still have huge shame about the fact that I hid my disability because I contributed to the discrimination. So now I open up and say, yeah, look, this is me. This is all of me. I can also tell you I'm in the middle of menopause. So there you go. That's another declaration. I think, the more we talk about things, the more we can do things. Myself and Michael spoke about that. And I think that's real and it's true. Look what's happening today.
Yes, definitely, completely agree with that. And we have another question from Liliana. How do we get businesses to move away from the recruitment attitude that a disabled position is a low-grade, sheltered workshop type role, rather than a disabled person can be a highly qualified, highly skilled professional?
Well, Liliana, you have Jacqueline and I on here right now. We're proof. And I love that you asked that question. Thank you so much because, well, firstly, I think the most important thing is about value. We still have, the greatest barrier is the 6 inches between our ears. What disability is? Does it really mean broken and damaged and less than? I'm kind of always very challenged when people say on the other side of abled is disabled. On the other side of ability is disability. I mean, I just actually don't agree with that. So I think we have to really encourage people who are in businesses at leadership levels to speak to their disability. That's number one, very important. The second is we have to link the need for the intelligence in our business to serve a diverse market space as the link for employment. Disability, the lived experience of disability provides extraordinary insight. It's an opportunity for innovation, for brand differentiation. This is not about simply recruitment in a small sheltered workshop, because that word disability covers so much physical, sensory, cognitive learning, mental health, everything. And then on that is a spectrum. So Liliana, Jacqueline and I both are legally blind, right? But we definitely don't have the same experience of it. And so this is my point. We're people first, right? We come in all shapes and sizes. We're not defined by our disability. It doesn't make a statement about who we are. And how to fix it is this. This is how we fix it. All these conversations, all these challenges, and making it safe for people to ask questions like you've just asked.
Fantastic. We just have time for one more question from Kate. Would you be willing to share a personal experience where you have felt excluded so that we can learn from this situation?
Oh my gosh. I really try and not be negative. But yes, I definitely can. When I first was a young global leader in the World Economic Forum, I never saw another person like me in the World Economic Forum, right? When you go to Davos, the big thing that happens in the Swiss mountains, all the big economic platform, one of the most influential in the world. And I remember Desmond Tutu speaking to this audience, and he said, I want everybody to stand up. And I mean, I couldn't see him on the stage, but I mean, he is the most powerful speaker. And he basically said, stay standing if you are a woman. And then he said, stay stand. And then so the men sat down. And then he said, stay standing if you are employed. And he kept going through all of these different characteristics. And as he was talking to what the point he was trying to make, because there were so few people left in the room after he said, stand standing if you're a woman and if you're employed and you've got a good job and he said, that's what it feels like to be black, or it felt like to be black. And I remember looking around the room and going, but that's even more than it feels like to have a disability. Because I couldn't see anybody who spoke to it. I couldn't see anybody who talked to it. I felt on my own. And therefore, I didn't speak. I didn't, because his point was so well made. He was talking about somebody from a different racial background and talking to that exclusion. And I remember sitting there going, that's what it feels like to have a disability. Because I can't see where I'm going. Nobody speaks about it. If I bring it up in a conversation, you can see people getting uncomfortable and shifting in their seats. And I'm delighted to say that was a long, long time ago. And now I go back to the World Economic Forum and we take main stage. And so that was a really good motivator. And I'm not joking you. It was in that meeting, and I'm a massive Desmond Tutu fan. I'm like, if we could do a tiny part of what he did for disability, and one way that I knew I could prove it to the world was to take the main stage and never let anybody feel that they were invisible again.
Wow. Thank you so much, Caroline. Thank you so much for being online with us today. I really resonated with a number of things you talked about, in particular that you are not defined by your disability and that you are just you. And inclusion is just being human. And that is just really simple and really relevant, I think, as well. It's been wonderful chatting to you today, and we hope to see you in Australia in the near future. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
No, thank you, Jackie. And I will come to Australia at the drop of a hat.
Thank you so much.
An important part of supporting each other is about building our diverse community. I'd like to introduce you to and encourage you to join the DENconnect online community. It's been created as a safe, open and accessible forum for employees in the New South Wales public sector to meet, learn, share stories, celebrate and support and champion each other. This has been a challenging year. Our resilience and adaptability have been truly tested. We've made some big leaps in terms of technology and the way we work, such as working from home. But maybe it's fair to say some of those gains have come at the expense of our connection to each other. Arguably, there's never been a more important time to make all of us feel like we're in this together. Next, I'll be talking to Secretary Jim Betts. Jim is the Secretary of the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment. We'll be discussing the impact of COVID-19 for the people living with a disability and how organisations can support our employees' mental health during this particularly challenging time. Jim, real pleasure chatting to you today.
Likewise.
I know you're an advocate for diversity and inclusion, not just disability, but all aspects of diversity and inclusion. Why is it important for you to rock the boat when you see diverse groups being left behind?
Well, I think the boat needs a good rock, to be honest. When you get a role like mine or any secretary or senior leadership job in the public service, you're only there with the best will in the world for a limited period of time. And we can judge our legacy as human beings by how senior we are and how important we are and how much money we earn, or we can judge it by what we stand for. And I've led a very privileged life, had a lot of life chances given to me that haven't been given to other people. I haven't faced the same physical, mental, economic, social, cultural barriers that other people have faced. I haven't encountered significant prejudice or discrimination in my life, but I know that other people have. And whether it's people with disability or Aboriginal people or LGBTIQ plus community, I want them to know that I'm there for them and that I'll do everything I can during whatever period of time I'm given in this role to push things forward, to make things easier for the next generation than they have been for the current one, just as they, people work very, very hard for a long period of time to improve the life chances of people in those different communities today as against what their previous generations might have experienced. So it's a passion thing for me, and I've found that as I've got into this role and made connections, for instance, with people in our disability employee network, the passion that they bring, their capacity to educate me, just reinforces my commitment to rocking that boat and making sure that the future doesn't just belong to people who look and sound like me, but that we have genuine diversity in the workplace, which reflects the very, very diverse communities that we serve. I mean, the business case is so obvious, right? It barely needs to be stated, but apparently it does need to be stated because we still get pushback. And when I talk in public forums about my commitment to those various causes and to those various people, it's heartening, but it's also a little bit shocking that people still give you the feedback that that's the first time they've heard someone talk about mental illness openly, or the first time that they've heard a really strong commitment from a non-Aboriginal person to working with community, or the first time that the doors have been opened to people with disability to tell their story. On one level that's good, but on the other hand it's a reflection of the challenges that we still face in 2020 in building an inclusive workplace.
Great. Jim, what are some of the challenges that your department's faced during COVID-19, particularly for people with disability?
Well, I think our experience has been similar to that of many workplaces, not just across the public sector, but across the whole of Australia. Obviously, in the very early days, it was an extremely daunting experience for people. We didn't know how it was going to play out. There were a lot of people in the community who were particularly vulnerable, and within the department there were particularly vulnerable people who might be immune compromised or were in vulnerable groups like Aboriginal people. So lots of anxiety. But as things have gone on and through the good leadership that we've had in New South Wales, we've also been able to discern some silver linings in all of this, and the way in which we've normalised and mainstreamed remote and flexible working has been a great leap forward culturally that we probably wouldn't have anticipated. We were talking about flexible working and remote working as something that we aspired to, but we were struggling to get middle managers really to give permission to their staff to take up the full range of flexible options that were available, and that was a particularly important issue for people with disability. And so when we look at our surveys, and we've regularly surveyed our staff, they have issues around internet connectivity and around social isolation and childcare and keeping in regular touch with the workplace. But for people with disability, the mainstreaming of things like Microsoft Teams and our social media platform Workplace, allied to accessibility measures we put in place like captioning and obviously people's capacity to lip read if they have hearing impairment, has meant that COVID has opened up new areas of opportunity and connection for people with disability in a way which is actually on balance positive, notwithstanding the very daunting circumstances in which we found ourselves. And that's reflected in the survey data that we collect.
So what specifically has DPI been doing to support people with disability?
Well, in the context of COVID, obviously, we've all become much more reliant on ICT, information and communications technology, for the purposes of remote working, and we've used platforms like Teams and like Workplace to really ramp up the level of connection between people across the department in the context of what otherwise would be quite a socially isolating experience. And it's been pleasing to see that the disability employee network within the department itself have been early adopters of that technology and have used it to remain connected to each other as well as to their own teams on a day-to-day basis. And related to that, we've launched sort of accessibility protocols as standard practice for all the engagements that take place, the way in which people conduct meetings, but also the way we do our social media, so that we do have captions and other aids to people with disabilities of different kinds. Our work health and safety and accommodation teams have got very quickly onto making sure that we are supporting people with disability through ergonomic assessments, whether that's when they're working from home or as we start now planning a progressive return to work. We've had, I think, over 400 interactions with those teams in terms of adjustments to the working environment. So really good to see that uptake. We had an experience or an event last year before COVID came into our lives, where we, as a leadership team, and this was based on something that Michael Coutts-Trotter and Anne Skews had done at the former Family and Community Services Department, brought our disability employee network members into our leadership team and gave them, as much time as they needed over more than an hour to tell us their own personal stories about their experiences of discrimination, bias, conscious and unconscious in the workplace. And unless you're hearing it from people who are experiencing it in their language, in their terms, you're not really getting the full picture. So that has that quite confronting experience has been worth its weight in gold, and has meant that the priorities of the very diverse community of people that have disability within the sector have been front and mind for us. So as we went into COVID, and that came on the back of a major relocation for us to 4 Parramatta Square, we had several thousand people moving into this new building. We've got equivalent relocations in Orange and in Newcastle. It's meant that the needs of people with disability have been very much in the forefront. We haven't got everything right, but it was a good experience to set us up for the challenges associated with COVID, and to make sure that we could take advantage of the crisis and make sure that we didn't waste it from the point of view of turning out to the advantage of our very diverse workforce.
Excellent. Jim, one of the themes we're discussing this International Day of People with Disability is that not all disability is visible. This has a direct tie-in with mental health, and of course there's an intersection between mental health and the experience of people with disability during the pandemic. What has your organisation been doing to look after people's mental health specifically during this time?
Well, that is a really great question, and I think we've talked about some of the big leaps forward that we've been able to make, some of the silver linings associated with COVID. And we've talked about flexible and remote working and so on. I would say that the capacity for people to talk more openly about mental health and well-being as a really important issue has greatly increased in the context where all of us have been feeling daunted. We've all of us experienced a level of isolation. When I first became Secretary of DPI 18 months ago, I engaged with a lot of people, met a lot of people across the cluster, did a lot of town halls, put out a lot of bulletins and other forms of staff communication. And I talked in that about my own experiences with depression in my life, and talked about it, in a very personal way. It was a depression which was connected to experiences I'd had in the workplace, and I was setting that in the context of the culture that I wanted in the organisation, and a culture which was kind and compassionate and collaborative, and where people felt that their workplace was somewhere they went for a helping hand, rather than somewhere where they went where they felt isolated or excluded or discriminated against. And that if we didn't create that supportive workplace, then we would put at risk people's mental health and well-being. And that required me to talk about my own lowest ebb in my life. I hope that made a small contribution. If people could see the Secretary talking openly about experiences of anxiety and depression, and other forms of mental illness, then that made it okay for people to talk about their own mental health and well-being and reach out and ask for help. So when we have Are You OK Day, and we had numerous sessions on health, and we've had almost 100 sessions educating people about health and well-being. We've set up well-being ambassadors. We've got a guy called Jim Bentley, who's my Deputy Secretary responsible for water, who's also taken on the role within our leadership team across the department as being mental health and wellbeing ambassador. It begins to become mainstreamed in a way that you begin to hope that people at all levels in the organisation who might be struggling, and I suspect that people in all levels of the organisation have been struggling during this course of this year, that they'll feel more confident to reach out and ask for help, knowing that their request for help will be answered in a way which is sympathetic, that is tailored to them, where they don't lose control and become part of a bureaucratic process, and that they don't get stigmatized as a result of asking confidentially for assistance. I think that's really important, and that requires us to be emotionally intelligent about the way we communicate with our people, and be very, very diligent in the way in which we follow up when people do actually ask for help. And that's, when people are asking for help with their mental health and well-being, they're intrinsically in a vulnerable position. When you combine that with people with disability who may be having, all kinds of compounding issues in terms of impaired mobility or impaired ability to communicate with people, makes it even more important that we respond with sensitivity and kindness.
And thank you for sharing that. It's hugely important, I think, for senior leaders to be able to talk openly, and thank you for sharing your story. Jim, now I'd like to discuss your relationship with the department's Disability Inclusion Network.
Yeah.
What values do you attribute to peer support or employee resource groups, and what do you want to do to support them?
The main thing that I want to do with our Disability Employee Network is to empower them, to ensure that their voice gets heard strongly and clearly by the decision makers within the department, and that we do more than tokenistic consultation. We actually have an ongoing relationship where they feel at ease, they feel confident to tell truth to power, and then when they do tell us what issues they're facing, what barriers they and others across the cluster are facing, that they see us respond with action. But as we take action, we continue to be deeply engaged with those networks. And I think the work that we've done around the relocation to Parramatta Square, our response to COVID, and the Disability Inclusion Action Plan, which we've undertaken, that has been very much produced by people with disability within the cluster, supported by other functions, work health and safety functions, our accommodation group, our IT, corporate services and so on. So it's been very much an alliance of equals. But part of the trick in doing jobs like mine is to sort of deconstruct the power and the awe that comes with being the secretary so that people can speak up with confidence. And I've been very lucky that we've had a strong disability employee network within the cluster with some great leaders like Anne-Marie Marnie, and they have encouraged others within that group to do pretty daunting things like come and talk to the leadership team and speak very openly, candidly about where our shortcomings are and where we need to take action. But if people aren't prepared to do that, then the leadership team will never know the problems that still confront people on a day-to-day basis. And when people do take that step over the threshold and come in and really tell us what's actually going on, it means we can lift our game. We can lift our game in terms of boosting employee numbers within the cluster, ensuring that we remove the processes and the bureaucracy that people find daunting and intimidating, and that we address the small, easy to solve, low-hanging fruit type issues, which are day-to-day frustrations or barriers for people, whether it's installing hearing loops or making sure that we iron out the last little bits of barriers to genuine accessibility within the workplace. It all stems from having real conversations where people who would otherwise be seen as a vulnerable group within the department are given a seat at the top table and are given every encouragement to speak with candour.
Really important message, thank you. Jim, can you outline what DPI have been doing to support the Premier's priority target of employing 5.6% of people with disability by 2025?
Sure. The first thing I want to say is that the Premier's priority encompasses, as you know, a series of different metrics around diversity and inclusion, women in leadership positions, Aboriginal people in senior leadership positions. And by and large, our department is travelling okay against the latter two. But I think it's a general issue within the sector that we are not coming close to meeting the Premier's priority target of 5.6%. And in fact, things seem to be trending gently in the wrong direction, but we're not on the right trajectory at the moment. One of the things that I think is revealed through the engagement that we've had with our Disability Employee Network and other things like the People Matter engagement survey is that there remain inhibitions to people talking about the disability that they might have. People fear that it will stereotype them, that they'll be discriminated against, that they'll be discounted from having the same opportunities as everybody else in the workplace. So as much as anything, there are cultural hurdles to be overcome in terms of encouraging people and giving people permission to identify as having a disability, confident that they're not going to face discrimination down the track. We have a disability inclusion action plan, as do other departments. The principal challenges, I think, remain cultural around that reluctance to identify, but I hope that the various active measures that the department has within its action plan will begin to reverse that trend and begin to point us firmly in the right direction. There are material steps that we can take as a department through actions which are demonstrable to people with disability to show that we are people who care and that we are a department that puts them and their needs front and centre. And that Disability Inclusion Action Plan contains measures like the workplace adjustment passport, whereby we don't put people through the ringer of having to declare and describe their disability every time their circumstances change. There's one point where you have to tell us, and then that's carried forward on a confidential basis. So we're not throwing up all kinds of psychological barriers and requiring people to go through the same traumatic conversations time and time again. We need to be really sophisticated in the way we frame and pursue employment opportunities for people with disability, so that we write our job ads in a way which resonates with them. We need strong partnerships with disability employment providers outside of government, and do all of these things with strong, visible executive leadership and sponsorship, so that we, people in the community, in the disability community, see us as being people who genuinely care and will genuinely be there for them if and when they come and join our workforce, and that we create advocates within our own workforce. Come and work for DPI. They are genuinely good people to work for if you've got a disability, and when you face a crisis in your life or if you're in strife, then the leadership care, the organisation has a human face. That's the kind of combination of tangible action around process and procedure combined with visible, authentic leadership. That's the only way we're going to achieve that target, which is why these targets are important. We have to care about them. We have to bring passion and commitment to achieving them. And when things are heading in the wrong direction, as they have been, we need to call that out and be really frank with people and not try and find ways of massaging that inconvenient truth away. So that's why I'm keen to talk about this openly, because I want to create a burning platform where it is just not acceptable that the proportion of people with disability in the public sector is in decline. We can't reflect our community whilst we allow that to happen. So people like me should be kept awake at night, worrying about that and being committed to turning it around. The other point I'd make about targets, and I think this is true of Premier's priorities generally, not just those related to diversity and inclusion, is that the targets are about a point in time. But the main thing is to maintain the range. We want to get as close to or exceed all of our targets. And so those targets are check-in points, they're not end points.
Great point, thank you. And Jim, finally, I'm told that you're a big fan of cemeteries. Do you want to explain what that's about?
Yeah, that's based on a true story, Chris. So I like to do lots of walking on the weekend. That's the way I unwind, that's the way I process, that's the way I deal with stress. So I'll go for a 20-25k walk around different bits of Sydney, and I like to explore. If ever I get back to Melbourne, I like to explore my hometown as well. And that's really good for my mental health and well-being. But I do have a particular penchant for cemeteries, whether it's Rookwood Cemetery or Waverley, which is obviously a pretty spectacular cemetery. But there are numerous cemeteries around our major cities. And what I find is that they're a great monument and embodiment of multicultural Australia. So if you go to somewhere like Rookwood, you can go to the Holocaust Memorial within Rookwood and have a moment of reflection there. You can see the Catholics, you can see the great diversity of different waves of migration that have come through our major cities, over the last 150, 200 years, the post-war migration of Greeks and Italians, and more recent waves of immigration from Lebanese, Vietnamese communities, and it's all there set out, geographically for you. So exploring cemeteries is a good way of keeping fit, but it's also kind of a good way of reminding ourselves about the diversity of our community and the amazing, millions of stories that underlie each one of those tombstones, the tragedies, but the triumphs of people coming from incredibly disadvantaged backgrounds and making this incredible leap to of faith to come to the other side of the world and build new lives for their families, often with no literacy, certainly with very little money, and it's all there embodied in our cemeteries. And also I have portfolio responsibilities for cemeteries as part of DPI, so I guess I should keep an eye on them and make sure they're being well maintained. So, a bit of the professional and the personal there, but mostly personal.
That's a great reminder for us all. And Jim, I really want to thank you for making the time out of your busy schedule to talk to us today.
It's been great. Thank you very much.
Thanks to all of you for attending this celebration. Every one of you, just by being here, is helping to create more awareness around this crucial issue. I hope you enjoyed the discussion and you've taken away a better understanding of how all of us can benefit from a more diverse workforce. As part of shaping our future priorities for inclusion across New South Wales Government, we would like to hear from you. Your opinions are important to us, so please, I encourage you to take a moment to share your thoughts by completing a short survey provided at the conclusion of this event. Finally, I'd like to thank the DENconnect members who've organised this event for us today. If you're a person with disability or an advocate wishing to support inclusion, please join the DENconnect community. Let's keep this momentum up and the conversation going. This is just the beginning, as clearly there is more to inclusion and more to us. Thank you.